if you didn't know that they were letters from World War II, they would be kind of boring because they don't really talk about the war. Instead, they talk about how pilots are trained and how they prepare to go to war, what they do in their spare time. And in my dad's case, he does happen to mention all the young ladies that he had dates with. And gee, you know, if I had known he was such a ladies' man when I was 18 years old, I would have paid a lot more attention. But he tells in the letters, tells them everything that happened and went on, and in very detailed description. And when I finished reading through some of the letters, I thought, gee, this is so unique that it has to be told. Well, the end result was, or is the book, Cheerio and Best Wishes. It took about 2 years of research, and my wife will tell you it was 2 years of research 24/7, because I didn't do much more than that, just do the research, to finally get the book ready to go to a publisher. In the process of all of that, I had some really unique research tools available to me, and you're going to see one of those, or portions of one of those, in a few minutes. But I had to start the book someplace, and the book does not start on December the 7th, 1941. The book starts in Wadesville, Indiana, with a young boy growing up, and how he moved from Wadesville to Evansville and pursued his own career in business. So that was the first part where the book started, and that's where you have to really delve into it. And in the process of all that, I got a really acute understanding of what life was like here in Evansville. So you're going to see a little bit about that today. Before I go any further, I would like to introduce the man that wrote the letters and have him tell you a little bit about them. So please welcome my dad, Ralph Schenk.
I'm not too familiar with all these microphones and everything. I usually start out my comments about asking if anybody here has ever been to Posey County, but most of you live here in Evansville, you couldn't help but get into Posey County. My mother and father were born in Posey County in the 1880s, and they spent their whole life here. Not until the automobile and the gravel roads came along, and a big trip for them was to go to Evansville, believe it or not. We generally came about twice a year, made the trip over here, and I can remember traveling in the old Model T Ford and everything. I don't remember exactly when it was, but there was no travel much by airplane until, I guess, probably the late 1920s or maybe the early 1930s. American Airlines started flying passengers from Chicago down to St. Louis. St. Louis. From St. Louis, they had a flight that went east, probably to Cincinnati or Pittsburgh. That flight going east flew directly over our house. I lived out in Posey County out there on a farm, and I remember sitting on the porch and watching this airplane fly over, not very high above the ground, and I would think to myself, boy, wouldn't it be nice to fly, and I could see things that I couldn't see any other way. When I graduated from high school, the high school principal interviewed all the graduating class. There were just 13 of us. And I think what he had in mind was to revise the subjects being taught. But he asked everybody what they would like to do now that they are out of high school. When he asked me what I'd like to do, I said, I want to be a flyer. Well, he actually laughed at me. He says, flying is a very dangerous profession, and you ought to choose something else. So from then on, I told everybody, well, I'll be a farmer like my dad. But I didn't forget about the flying. My father and I had a lot of discussion about what I would do, and I even offered to stay on the farm if he bought a tractor, and we would hire out and so forth. Finally, he says, the best thing to do is go to Evansville and get some kind of a job and go to school. Well, that's exactly what I did. I went to Lockyer Business College. They got me a job at the Ford agency, and it went out of business. And then I got a job with L.A. Parker and Company. We sold food. But all during this time, I didn't forget about the flying. And then the war came along, as you know, and I said, I found out that the Army would like to train us to fly an airplane. Well, I went down to the recruiting office, and sure enough, they would train you to take care of an airplane, fly it, and so forth. And I jumped on it with both feet. I was accepted. I went to Indianapolis, enlisted in the Air Force, and I told my mother and father that if I ever got out of Purdy County, I would let them know what it was like outside of Posey County. So, sure enough, I did get to travel. I was sent to California. I found out that the places they would send you to train, there was nothing there. They had been built rather hastily. There was no place to go to the movies. There was no bowling alley. There was nothing to do. And I suddenly remembered that I had promised my mother that I would write her a letter. So I started writing letters at night, more just to have something to do rather than anything else. And I started writing the letters, and I just sort of kept it up, so to speak. Eventually, I was sent to a B-24 bomber group, and we were ordered to England. I got there in December 1943. I stayed there a year and a half in England. It gave me a lot of opportunities to write a letter because I got to talk to people who were not Americans, so they had a different view than what I had on a lot of things. I got to see a lot of places over there in that part of the world, and I kept writing letters, more like I say, having something to do more than anything else. And I think a lot of the letters that is in that book were written during that time frame that I was in England. So that's the story and why I started writing the letters. That's the way it was. Thank you.
The young men and women that grew up in the 1930s all had a few things in common that today we kind of look back in history and we don't really expect that they had much of an impact, but these things kind of drew this generation together. The first was the Dust Bowl, which actually started in the late 1920s and continued on through the 30s. It moved huge amounts of dirt from the plain states all the way to the East Coast and had a tremendous impact on the farmers throughout the country because suddenly wheat and corn were in short supply, and the rest of the nation had to somehow grow enough to make up that difference. The next was Prohibition. A lot of people think that Prohibition was just an American phenomenon. The fact is the United States was one of the last countries to establish Prohibition laws. It really started in Europe and became very fashionable over there. Fortunately, or I suppose fortunately, Europe dismantled their laws about the same time that we dismantled ours. But Prohibition had a tremendous impact on this generation because even though it was illegal to make and sell alcohol and consume it, nobody really stopped. So they just found a way to get around it. Another thing that drew this generation together was tuberculosis. Tuberculosis was a 1920s phenomenon, but in the 1930s, every family, and I would say every household, either knew a family member or a friend who had died from tuberculosis. In the state of Indiana in the 1920s, nearly 27,000 people died from tuberculosis alone, and there were easily that many more that were stricken with the disease and somehow overcame it or at least lived through it. The Great War, that's what we called World War I before we had World War II. Everybody also had a family member or a close friend that had participated in the Great War, and those people by the 1930s now were the leaders of the country, and many of them became isolationists. They didn't want the United States entering into any other war or conflict. That's why if you look at the history books, you'll see that Roosevelt had to implement a new act called the Lend-Lease Act. He couldn't go to war because he didn't have the votes in Congress, and it really took an attack by a foreign country to draw us into that war. And a great part of that was because of the veterans that came out of World War I. Last is the Depression. The Depression began in the late 1920s and lasted throughout the 1930s. If it hadn't been for the war, it might have gone on well into the 1940s. As you'll see in a minute, there's a comment about the jobs that were created because, first of all, because of the Lend-Lease program, but then because of going to war, there were a tremendous amount of jobs. And of course, we all know today that if you have jobs, you can pull yourself out of a depression. Of particular note to local banks here, many of the local banks informed their customers that they were going to cut their mortgage rate in half, and that if all they could do was pay the interest, they would not lose their property. And that's a tremendous thing for a community to do. Okay, now you're going to have to bear with me because I have to go start a little video. You're going to see some excerpts from a longer video. It is a video that was prepared by Ralph about 30 years ago. I will tell you that this was before digital anything, and most of this was shot with a handheld video camera, if you remember VHS and all of that tape stuff. And you'll see some, even though it's been digitized, you'll see some of the effects of the tape. And I hope you find it interesting. Just bear with me. It gets louder.
was simple for a farm boy growing up among the corn and wheat fields of southern Indiana during the 1920s and 30s. I was born in this house in Posey County, Indiana, near the town of New Harmony on the 11th of November, 1919. My parents, Rolla and Jesse, bought a farm near Wadesville, Indiana, and we moved there in the spring. These are my older sisters, Wanda Marie on the left and Marcia Elizabeth on the right. There is always work to be done on a farm, especially during the summer, but if there was no urgent work, the whole family dressed up and went to town on Saturday afternoon. This fire station now occupies the site of the general store where a church group or ladies club usually sponsored an ice cream social under the big canopy in front of the store. Directly across the street where this building now stands was a gasoline station, and diagonally across the street was the local tavern. I remember there was a long bench in front that was usually occupied by the same men each Saturday. I think they felt it befitting or maybe even a duty to engage the young ones in conversation. Heading into the tavern for my bottle of soda pop, I could count on one of the men saying, "Hi there, young feller, what do you want to be when you grow up?" Almost every boy or girl that I knew had visions of doing something other than living on a farm. I certainly was no exception and dreamed of being a drummer in a band, a train engineer, a baseball player, or maybe running a wheat thrashing steam engine like these I saw near New Harmony, Indiana. In 1929, the stock market crashed and the Great World Depression set in. Suddenly, no one had any money, but farmers fared better than most because they had food and they ate the best of it. I attribute my good health today on the wholesome food, clean air, and hard work of those days. The poor farmers had a hard time providing teachers for the 150 students attending Wadesville High School. In some cases, the teachers were not college graduates, but were certified to teach certain subjects to certain grades. This is our high school freshman class. There are only 11 of us. The lady being pointed at was Miss Maybelle Miller, our class advisor. This was her first job as a teacher. Our high school subjects were very basic, as you can see by my grade sheet. The biology classes and physics classes were textbook only, for there was no laboratory. During the 1930s, I was impressed by the heroic deeds of the FBI as they hunted down the crime gangs of Scarface Al Capone, Babyface Nelson, and others. Then in 1934, when Indiana's own John Dillinger was killed at Chicago's Biograph Theater, I was certain I wanted to be an FBI agent. I was only 7 years old when Lindbergh made his famous 1927 flight across the Atlantic in this airplane. It didn't impress me much, for I had never seen an airplane up close. Then in 1935, Eastern Airlines started flights between St. Louis, Evansville, and Louisville. The plane flew almost over our house every day. Many times I watched it from our back porch and wondered what it would be like to fly. In my junior year, the new high school principal, Curly Melton, interviewed all students. The main purpose was, what do you want to do after graduation? His aim was to revise the subjects being taught. Most of the boys said they would try for a factory job or as an alternative work on a farm. When he asked me, I said, I want to be a flyer. Almost shouting, he said, you want to be a flyer? Then he laughed and said flying was a very dangerous profession and I should choose something more realistic. From then on, I told everyone I'd be a farmer. The usual reply was, following your dad's footsteps, say, well, that's the right thing to do. But I didn't forget about the airplanes. Basketball and baseball were our only school sports. During the summer in the first 2 years of high school, I played baseball with the Posey County American Legion team. This was the reason for the P on my uniform. These are the new uniforms we had for the Indiana State Tournament. We made the finals, but lost the final game to a big East Chicago team. When I graduated from high school, my father and I had several discussions about whether I should stay on the farm. He finally advised me to get some kind of a job and go to college. So, in the fall of 1937, I enrolled in Lockyear's College to take accounting and other business subjects. This was the main building. I got a job at Cervell, the gas refrigerator maker, earning $30 to $40 a week. I attended school in the mornings and worked full-time on the 2 to 10 p.m. shift. I kept this grueling schedule for 1.5 years. It did not leave much time for homework, but I had no alternative. In the spring of 1939, Lockyear's got me a job at Rice Motors, a Ford agency. But 6 weeks later, Ford closed them down for illegal practices. Soon I got a job with L.A. Parker, the food broker. I was their one and only bookkeeper, and the pay was only $12.50 a week, but I felt I could learn something about business. All during this time, Adolf Hitler was causing all sorts of trouble. He had visions of conquering all of Europe and perhaps the whole world. The year 1940 was filled with anxiety and rumors. When the draft was approved in September, most everyone realized it was just a matter of time until the U.S. entered the war. Many men enlisted so they could choose their branch of service, but about this time the Army Air Corps began recruiting for the aviation cadet program, and I figured I would rather be a flyer than a foot soldier. So late in 1940, I visited the recruiting office, and Sergeant Rarborough gave me this booklet. This imposing picture is a building on Randolph Air Force Base, which at that time was nicknamed West Point of the Air, and where much of the flying took place. The booklet explained that as a flying cadet, I would be furnished all clothing, food, lodging, and paid $75 a month. This sounded real good to me. I met all requirements except the 2 years of college. Instead, I would have to pass a written examination. The exam covered these subjects, and a passing grade was required in each of them. Sergeant Rarborough said the Junior Chamber of Commerce was sponsoring a refresher course because several boys were interested. On his suggestion, I signed up for it, and he also scheduled us for a physical exam by the National Guard doctor. The main emphasis was on the eyes. The 10-week refresher course conducted by high school teachers started the last week of February 1941. We went 5 nights a week for 3 hours. Working 5.5 days a week left me little time to study. Tests were graded in Washington, D.C. 3 of us did not pass. The result indicated I did very good except in physics and chemistry, and was accompanied by a recommendation that I study on these subjects and be retested in 90 days. The Junior Chamber of Commerce agreed to sponsor another course, this time for only 6 weeks, but the instructors were from Evansville College. I also had the benefit of knowing the type of questions that were on the previous exam. The test took 3 days and was conducted by Major Perkins at the Evansville Armory. Each person was placed at a desk 10 feet from any other. We were required to complete each subject in 2 hours, except for trigonometry and geometry. We were allowed 3 hours. The test results came back 1 or 2 at a time. Some had already been notified when I was called the last week of October to take the physical for the draft. Then on the 7th of November, I was notified I had passed and orders would follow shortly. Oh boy. With the U.S. providing food and war materials for our allies, jobs became plentiful almost overnight. Even with more money to spend, Evansville didn't have much to offer in the way of entertainment. Shopping down Main Street during lunch break was a very popular pastime. Then there was the movies. Another favorite pastime was the radio. Besides the local station, my favorite was WLS Chicago, which came in loud and clear. On Saturday nights, they had the WLS Barn Dance with good country and western music. On December the 7th, 1941, I remember it well, for December the 7th was my mother's birthday. She and my father had driven in from the farm to my sister Marcia's house on Ravenswood for a noon birthday meal. She had our all-time favorite stuffed pork chops. After eating, Herb, Marcia's husband, returned to work at his gasoline station along with my dad. Sandra Jane was taking her afternoon nap, and my mother, Marcia, were cleaning up the dishes. I had rushed to the front room to take over the easy chair by the radio to wait for the big band program to come on from WLS. This program was suddenly interrupted to announce that Pearl Harbor in Hawaii had been attacked by Japanese warplanes. Things happened pretty fast after the speech. On Monday afternoon, I got a call from Sergeant Barbaro, the recruiter, asking me to remain close by the telephone where I could be reached immediately. On Tuesday, he called and said my physical was over 6 months old and I was to report to the Indiana University Medical School Cadet Testing Section on December the 11th for a retest. On Wednesday, I cleaned out my desk at the office and said my goodbyes to my co-workers. One of the other boys going for a physical update drove us to the university. We arrived about 9 a.m. and started the exam immediately. I breezed through the first part where my eyes, blood pressure, pulse, and all that stuff was checked. We then stripped to our shorts and one by one went in to see the doctor. He said, walk over there and sit on that table so I can listen to your heart. And as I was walking, he said, why are you walking like that? I thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to flunk because of my feet. So I told him I had worn size 12 shoes since I was 14, and at the first exam, the doctor asked if my low arches gave me trouble. So after that, I began to curl my toes in and walk on the outer edges of my feet to make it appear as if I had high arches. This doctor then looked at my feet and said there was nothing wrong with them, but there would be if I continued to walk like that. He also said my heart and the rest of me was in great shape. We were an elated group going home since we all passed the exam and were one step further along to becoming an aviation cadet. On Friday, I went to the farm and spent the day with my mother and father. They had a small, sturdy cardboard box they gave me, and I packed the things that I was going to take with me. It was cold and foggy at 6 a.m. when 4 of us met at the Evansville recruiting office on Saturday, December the 13th. We each received some papers to take with us. Ken Silverman's dad had volunteered to drive us the 175 miles to Fort Benjamin Harrison on the northeast side of Indianapolis. It was drizzling rain when the guard at the gate told us where to report. Ken's dad went inside, and moments later a man in a uniform appeared. He took our papers and asked each one of us if we wanted to enlist in the Army as an aviation cadet. After we all answered yes, he says, stand in the line, raise your right hand, and repeat after me. It began, I, Ralph Herbert Schenk, do you solemnly swear, and went on from there.
Chamber of Commerce offered. And before I start that, I want to point out, in case you missed it when he was showing his grades, in 1937, F was average.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Just make sure everybody knows that. But the fact remains that most of the high schools in the area, including some of the high schools in Evansville, did not have adequate facilities to teach anything that required a lab. So chemistry, physics, and biology were pretty much textbook oriented. Additionally, higher math was something that wasn't really touched on in high schools then, and that was something that the Army Air Corps wanted everybody to be proficient in. In order to make sure that Evansville was represented to the Army Air Corps, the Junior Chamber of Commerce established a program, as was mentioned in the video, and the first one was taught entirely by high school teachers, and it was under the organization of the superintendent of schools. This is a picture that appeared in the Evansville paper. on, I can't see the date from here, looks like May 6th, 1941. And this one identifies the young men that were in the class, and several of them, first two are from Evansville. You have one from Mount Vernon, another one from Evansville, one from Ada, Oklahoma, and one from Paducah, Kentucky. That's just in the back row. And then in the middle row, you have Madisonville, Kentucky, another one from Evansville, Mount Vernon, Indiana, another one from Evansville, Lawrenceville, Illinois, two of them actually from Lawrenceville, Illinois. And then in the back row, you have some more from Evansville, one from Princeton, another one from Henderson, Kentucky, and a few more from Evansville. The interesting thing about this program was that it wasn't just Evansville that didn't have the educational facilities to prepare these young men. As you can see from the attendees, they came from all over because it was something that they really wanted to do and they had nowhere else to go. So the Junior Chamber of Commerce played an important role in the lives of these young men. That's the top half of the article. My copy got ripped in half, so I missed part of it. This is the actual article itself, and it actually starts off saying that they've already agreed to do a second class. As was mentioned in the video, there were several that didn't pass the first time, and the Junior Chamber of Commerce decided to do another class, only this time they would get their instructors from Evansville College. The end result of that came in November in this article. And the interesting thing about this article, which I found absolutely fascinating, and you would never see this in a newspaper article today, it gives you the address of each one of the boys that were in the class. So it tells you where they live. Interestingly enough, I believe it's William Wimsatt was from Ada, Oklahoma in the first class. He eventually settled down apparently here in Evansville and brought his friend Charles Pierce, they were next door neighbors, brought him to the next class. The ones with asterisks, which are Gene Ernest Crabtree, William Mole, both from Mount Vernon, and then Ralph Schnack and William Wimsatt, they were the ones that did not pass the first class, so they re-enlisted or re-enrolled. And now, second time around, they did pass. So the Junior Chamber of Commerce was instrumental in providing the U.S. Army and the United States with Air Corps pilots. You all are familiar with the Evansville shipyard. You know that Evansville was building ships way before the Second World War started, and during the war it built LSTs. The museum has an LST which you can, from what I understand, you used to be able to see out the window before the construction started, and it's not too far from here. If you haven't seen it, it's pretty neat, and it's really worth your time to go and take a look. But there's some other contributions to the war besides the shipyard. It was mentioned in the first video about the Evansville Airport, and you've seen this picture before. This is taken at the Evansville Airport, and this is an Eastern Airlines airplane. You notice the paved runway, or parking area. Not real fancy, but that's the way things were in the 1930s. You probably are also aware that Republic Aviation built a factory near the Evansville Airport to build P-47s. This is a historic marker that sits in front of the building. Hopefully it will remain standing after the building is demolished. This is that particular item. There are some other things you may not know. This is what the building looked like at the height of production. A little bit different than what it looks like today. One of the things that I like about this is the employee parking lot and how clean the cars are. And if you look closely, you can see just about every kind of car imaginable. There's a Sportster, a Roadster, a couple of touring cars. There's just about every kind of car imaginable parked in the parking lot. So the people that came to work at this factory weren't just from one side of Evansville or the other. They came from all over, from all walks of life. to participate in the manufacturing of aircraft. This is what it was called Evansville Airfield, and it was an Army Air Corps airfield, or designated as that, in the 1940s. This picture was taken in 1943 and published in 1945 by the Army Air Forces Directory. It shows, I'm going to try my pointer here. This is the highway out here, and you'll notice a little road right here. And I'm going to tell you about that little road. No, wrong way. There we go. This is the airport taken in 1958, high altitude. Again, we've got the highway across here. This is the factory. And that is the little road that you saw in the previous one. It's actually part of a loop. And the story is that airplanes would come out of the factory. They had to go someplace because you don't see anywhere here to park an aircraft. So they had to go someplace. They would come out down this little connecting road and enter this loop. They would stop momentarily and they would test fire the machine guns that were on the aircraft into a hill in this area. And I'm not sure, I heard this from one of the pilots that used to shuttle aircraft out of this factory, and I could never understand if it was a mound of dirt that was left over from construction or if they fired it into the hillside. In this picture, there's some development going on in the hillside area here, but there was none in the 1940s. So I don't know exactly where they fired into. If the airplane checked out at that point, they would continue through the loop and then take off on one of the two runways, probably this one right here. If there was a problem, they would double back and go back into the factory where they would get repair work done so that the aircraft would be able to make the first leg that it had to go to. Now remember, these aircraft were being shuttled in some cases by women, and that's the lady I talked to was a lady pilot, and she shuttled aircraft out of this facility. But this was the only facility she shuttled them out of, so they had to go someplace fairly close. Does anybody have any idea where they turned the aircraft over to the Army? Well, they went to George Field in Lawrenceville, Illinois. And this was an Army field designed to receive aircraft. You can see all of this area here is all parking. The real white is paved parking, and this is a maintenance facility. This picture was taken in 1956, and they had a maintenance facility located in here so that aircraft would come in, they would park them there until they were ready to turn them over to a pilot or to a squadron. And so at one point during the war, there were hundreds of aircraft parked there. This is what the airfield looks like today, and you can still see the paved parking areas right here, and you can see the other runways that used to intersect. Those have been plowed up and returned back to farming. But I never could figure out how they got back to Evansville. Somebody told me they took a bus back. They would shuttle 5 or 6 planes at a time, and then they would come back, and the next day they would take 5 or 6 more. I also heard that there was some kind of a transport plane that would take off and bring them all back, but they did shuttle 5 or 6 planes at a time. Another significant contribution was this gentleman, Paul Schlunt. Paul Schlunt was ran his own pilot training program out of the Evansville airport, and he trained people that were interested in flying in this aircraft. This is a Culver Cadet, and as you can see, it's a very tiny airplane. I've never seen one in person because they're very, very hard to find. I can only imagine that inside is quite cramped, especially if you're a big person. This is Ralph standing here next to the aircraft. Paul Schlunt had a reputation for helping any young man that wanted to join the Air Corps. And he would provide free lessons, and sometimes he would ask them to to pay for the fuel. Sometimes if he had fuel left over from a previous lesson, he would pick up some individual, take him for a ride, show him the ropes, let him fly the plane, and there would be no charge to it. Interestingly enough, the Army found out about Mr. Schlund, and he was asked to become the flight instructor and squadron commander of the 63rd Army Air Force Flight Training Detachment in Douglas, Georgia, which he did, and that's a picture of him at Douglas, Georgia, right here. During his time there, he helped train over 9,000 cadets. They participated in every theater of the war. They flew just about every aircraft that the Army Air Corps had. And the air school that he ran was one of the safest and most efficient air schools in all of the United States. When the war ended, he went to Embry-Riddle University in Arcadia, Florida, and instructed for 6 more months. And then he and his wife, who he met while he was in Douglas, Georgia, moved to Indianapolis, where he resumed his flying career, working for Roscoe Tanner, who was the Beechcraft distributor for Indiana, and he also ran their school, their flight school. He retired from what is now called Hunt Construction Company, and he died in 1999 at the age of 90 in Indianapolis. The curious thing is that he spent probably the last 30 years of his life trying to find every cadet, every instructor, and every employee that was at Douglas, Georgia. And the people in Douglas believe that he did find every one of them. And he was instrumental in establishing their museum and their alumni association. We're going to see one more clip.
Afternoon, there were only 4 of us left, and we were told we were going to Palo Alto Airport at King City, California, and would leave the next day, Tuesday, 16th of December. It was a slow train and made many stops, finally arriving at King City around 10:30 at night. We were the only ones who got off the train, and due to the blackout, the only light was from the lantern carried by the station master. He took us inside and called the airport, and about 15 minutes later, a truck arrived and picked us up. With bedding in hand, the sergeant major took us about a half a block away to this barracks and told us to find our way to the very last door, and that would be our room for the night. We were all talking as we stumbled along in the darkness when suddenly someone yelled, "Halt! Who goes there?" We continued to walk, and one of the guys said, "You think he's talking to us?" And about that time, "Who goes there? Halt, or I will shoot." And I heard a noise that sounded like a bolt being operated on a gun, and I thought to myself, "Oh my God, I'm going to be shot before I ever see an airplane." We all stopped in our tracks, and the voice said, "Advance and be recognized." But about that time, the sergeant came running up with a flashlight and talked to the guard. He then got us in the room, told us not to leave it, and he would be by in the morning and tell us what to do. It was well after 1 a.m. before all was quiet. We were told that the United Service Organization, commonly referred to as the USO, had established a facility in town and was having its grand opening that night. That evening after dinner, a shuttle bus took about 20 at a time into the USO building. We were instructed to stay only an hour or so in order to let everyone see the place. It turned out it was an old hardware store that had been cleaned up and a small stage built at one end. On one side of the building, several old men were sitting in the only available chairs. I suppose they were the husbands of the matronly old women on the other side who were serving punch and cookies. They must have thought we were going to tear the place up, for the local constable and his volunteer deputy were there. Also, there were 3 county sheriff's deputies and 1 state policeman. But everything went smooth, and a 3-piece combo played a little country and western music, and I was back at the barracks before 10 o'clock. Starting the 2nd week of January, I got to fly almost every day, and by the 7th, I'd accumulated over 6 hours. At 6 hours, everyone gets a check ride with an instructor other than your own.
Go fly a kite and tie your troubles to the tail.
And on the 8th of January, Mr. Hale said, "Let's go over to field number 3 and shoot landing." We're the only ones there, and after the fourth landing, as we were taxiing back for takeoff, he said, "Stop here. Can you fly this thing by yourself?" And I said, "I don't know." "Well," he said, "you better, because I'm getting out." I couldn't describe my feeling. I was really nervous and excited. I couldn't believe what I was doing, and when I got in the air, I let out the biggest war whoop you ever heard. I think they could have heard me clear back in Indiana. Upon landing, I stopped, and Mr. Hale hopped up on the wing and said, "Good landing," and pulled the dodo stripe off my helmet. He said, "Shoot 3 more landings and pick me up," which I did. When we got back to the home base, a bunch of friends came running out with congratulations and handshakes. They also cut my tie off, which they did to everyone. It was a good feeling. Officially, I soloed after 6 hours and 40 minutes of dual instruction. This is a diagram of the officers' barracks we lived in at Mesa Field. Bob Saunders and I shared 3 rooms together. Each had a bedroom, and then there was a common room that we both used that had tables and chairs. One Sunday near the end of the course, we were in the common room gradually taking it easy, but the telephone kept ringing, and after about 10 minutes, it got rather annoying, so I answered it. A sweet young female voice said, "Is Jimmy there?" I said, "Jimmy who? There's no Jimmy in this building." She said, "Jimmy Stewart." I told her, "You must have the wrong number. Jimmy Stewart is in Hollywood. This is Mesa Field in Sacramento." She said, "I talked to him at this number yesterday, and he wanted me to call him today and for you to yell loud because he would probably be asleep." So holding the receiver away, I yelled, "Jimmy Stewart!" The door I was standing by opened, and Jimmy Stewart came out and said, "That's for me." He came to our room and thanked us for waking him up. He told us he tried to get in the aviation cadet program, but he was over 27, which was the maximum age. But they told him if he learned to fly on his own and then passed the Army check rides, they would give him a commission. He was at Mather to take these check rides. For this, he also agreed to make some short publicity movies to encourage men to become an aviation cadet. In May, I was sent to B-17 Transition School at Hobbs, New Mexico. My orders were to report to Gowan Field, Boise, Idaho. I arrived on a Sunday afternoon, and when I checked into the BOQ, I was handed a note saying if I got there before 4 p.m. to come to the operations building. So I walked down there, over the door, and there sat Jimmy Stewart. He had seen my name on a list of arriving pilots and remembered me. We spent the next couple of hours catching up on each other's activities.
Go fly a kite and you'll learn that.
On May the 22nd, 1945, we headed for the United States, all flying in ground personnel, and their belongings were manifested on aircraft. We flew to Valley Airport in England, to Reykjavik, Iceland, to Goose Bay, Labrador, and we spent the night at each one of these places. From Goose Bay, we flew to Windsor Lock Airport near Hartford, Connecticut. Here, we turned in all government equipment and waited for a train to our hometown. I stayed in a barracks next to the officers' mess. It was open from 6 a.m. to midnight, and we could eat any time and as many times as we wanted. Would you hazard a guess as to what most people craved? Steak? No. Pie and ice cream? No. It was white bread. Our flour was provided by the British, and they didn't have white bread.
Go fly a kite and tie your troubles to the tail. They'll be blown away by a merry gale. Go fly a kite and toss your worries to the wind. And then they won't come back, they'll be too chagrined. Make friends with the sky, have a talk with the sun. It's the right way to live, if you will pardon the pun. Go fly a kite and you'll imagine you're a king, because you've got the world on a piece of string. Go fly a kite.
I would like to thank Tom Lundberg and the Evansville Museum for inviting me here today. and I hope you have enjoyed today's program. If you're interested in taking a look at the book or perhaps purchasing one, we're going to be set up out of the security desk, and we'd be glad to even just chat with you. Thank you very much for coming, and we really appreciate it.